I just got really obsessed with reading about it because it surprised me that if there was this thing that was the most common cause of male to female transsexualism, I was so surprised, like, why hadn't I heard of it? I live in Portland where trans people are very normal and accepted, and it's not a big deal. And it's like, why didn't I hear about this? Why didn't anyone tell me?
Welcome to Awake at the Wheel. On today's episode, we have a special guest, Phil Illy. And Phil is the author of Autoheterosexual, Attracted to Being the Other Sex. So this is a really interesting and exciting topic for both Oren and I. As you know, we did do a series regarding gender, but specifically in reading Phil's book, I found and learned that there were, in fact, quite a few gaps that I, even as a clinician, have with respect to this topic and with respect to the way in which it should be approached from our practice and as clinicians. So, Phil, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. To begin, I'm wondering if you can introduce yourself, let us know a little bit about yourself professionally, personally, and what inspired you to write this great book?
Start with my name. My name's Phil Illy. I'm autogynephilic, and professionally, in the past, I worked as a mechanical engineer, but I didn't really care for it, so I'm trying to switch out of that. And how I ended up here on this podcast is like 4 years ago, I found out I had a sexual orientation I'd never heard of. And it's kind of mind blowing. I've realized this at like age 31 when I read Alice Dreger's Galileo's Middle Finger and Bailey's The Man Who Would Be Queen. I was introduced to the typology, and it was pretty obvious to me that I wasn't the homosexual type, and therefore, by process of elimination, I had to be the autogynephilic type of like male with gender issues. And so I just got really obsessed with reading about it because it surprised me that if there was this thing that was the most common cause of male to female transsexualism, I was so surprised, like, why hadn't I heard of it? I live in Portland where trans people are very normal and accepted, and it's not a big deal. And it's like, why didn't I hear about this? Why didn't anyone tell me? And so I just kept reading. After like a year of intense reading of papers and such, I started writing the book. And then after about 3 years of that, it's finally out now. And so, yeah, the book I wrote, Autoheterosexual, Attracted to Being the Other Sex, it's a product of about 3 or 4 years of full-time work. And there's a lot in there. Yeah.
Did you find writing the book kind of helped you through that journey of self-exploration, or had you established where you're at with that and the book was kind of a bookend to it, no pun intended?
I had already become comfortable with like accepting of myself as autogynephilic by the time I even started writing it. But I just started writing it because I knew that the vast majority of people with gender issues weren't going to be reading academic papers from the 70s and 80s to try to figure out what was up with their situation. And so I wanted to translate what was found in academic papers into a form that like regular people could read and get meaning from. And also importantly, at the end of it, if they do have this orientation, like that they not feel icky at the end of it. That was important to me.
Okay.
I'm just going to jump in for a second because, yeah, I can't recommend this book enough. And Phil knows this. I think it was back in maybe November or December of last year. Phil sent me a published copy, and I read it. I started reading it, and I've got to say, and I said this to Phil. I said it actually changed my own book because it reads so smoothly. There's aside from all the new terms that people are going to have to learn.
Right.
Aside from that, and we'll talk about them. Just it was so smooth. And as Phil was saying, people aren't going to read scientific journals necessarily, but even non-scientific books sometimes can be clunky. They can be it can take a lot of effort to get through it. And I found myself just flowing through it, no effort whatsoever. And it was high level, difficult, let's say controversial issues, but presented in such a digestible way. So I told Phil after I read it, I was like, okay, I just changed my whole book. I've delayed my own publishing by about 6 months because I went back like from the beginning and just changed my approach because I saw
Hmm.
how it can be presented. And again, as I say, in such a digestible way. So I just want to praise the book for that. It's just a great read. It's got so much information. If you look at the references, it's backed by science. It's not just Phil's anecdotal experiences, not Phil talking to a couple of people. It's a review of the literature out there. Now, people are going to complain and say it's a selective view. It's a selective review of the literature. And we'll talk more about the controversies. But I am going to say, I'm going to throw this out there, Phil, if you don't mind, Malini. I just wanted to, before you get into your questions, to me, Phil, this could be a paradigm shifter. All right.
Yeah,
Changing
that's my
how,
intent.
okay. And so I know, Malini, maybe your first question might lead into that, this whole
Hmm.
shift in paradigm. I think it's the first question.
Yeah.
So I'll let you take it away. But yeah, I'll step back for a second.
Yeah. So first, I'll echo what Oren said, that you've made a complex topic very digestible and readable. So I think that's fantastic, again, for the general population and clinicians alike. But my first question is, I'm wondering if you can define for our audience what the difference is between autogynephilia and autoheterosexuality.
Well, I use so autogynephilia is a sexual attraction to being a woman, and I use the term autoheterosexual to include female autoandrophilia, which is love of self as man, and male autogynephilia with love of self as woman. To include, I use autoheterosexual to include both of these under a shared heading that places them as not literally the same phenomenon, but analogous counterparts. Where one will be more male typical, one will be more female typical in its expression, but that should be expected, just as homosexuality and heterosexuality differ between the sexes in sex typical ways.
So the goal was to have a more neutral term.
The goal of incorporating that term was I pretty early on decided I needed to talk about autoandrophilia, and I thought, like, there must be a term for describing both of these as equivalent phenomenon. Like, what is the term to describe this inverted heterosexuality? And I gotta say, like, it took me an embarrassingly long time to figure out that autoheterosexual was the right term. And yeah, I use that term just because I want to. It simplifies the typology, like stating the typology for both sexes. It makes it much quicker to communicate. And then both of the labels are about sexual attractions with respect to birth sex. So like like homosexual and autoheterosexual are similar in that way too. And it basically lets it plug into existing nomenclature in a pretty smooth way.
So you mentioned that it took an embarrassingly long time for you to arrive at that term. So without maybe getting into probably the 100 steps it took, can you share with us a little bit about like what that entailed?
Um, well, from about a couple months into learning about autogynephilia, I kept trying to think of like this term is poisoned in terms of just the discourse around it is awful, and I want a new term that doesn't sound so scary. Um, and as I was working on my book, I felt like it would be a big injustice to leave out autoandrophilia, and so I decided to include that as important. And I just knew I needed a term for that, and the something that led me to thinking of that term. I mean, I'd seen it used occasionally here and there. I'd seen it used a few times, like in passing, by people trying to think of a term for autoandrophilia and autogynephilia at the same time. But there's Blanchard has this one paper about the non-monotonic relation between male heterosexuality and autogynephilia. I think it came out in '92. And in the margins of this paper, just at the top, it said something like heterosexual male heterosexuality and autogynephilia or something like that. That was just in the margin, like the subject. And I kept wondering, why is one of these called heterosexual and why is one of them referred to as a type of gynephilia? Like, because male heterosexuality is gynephilia. Like, why are
Hmm.
we
Hmm.
using differently structured words to talk about attraction to the same sort of erotic target? You know?
Yeah. So, Oren, I know that you mentioned earlier in one of our chats that, and I want to kind of segue what you're saying here, Phil, was I know that in your journey to finding out more about yourself, some of Oren's previous content was inspirational to you and just kind of observing discussions from others, perhaps in similar situations. So, did you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah. Yeah, his YouTube channel, the Doc Amitay YouTube channel, he has interviews with Bailey, Blanchard, Dreger, you know, all the top dogs. And it was just so rare to find interviews with such people about that sort of thing. And he also had that interview with that detrans AGP male. Um and so it's just there's such a dearth of material out there that's accessible to people, and his channel had some of the little bit that was, pretty accessible to people. And so that helped a lot. In the first like month or two, I came across that.
Okay. And if I can say, so without any, breaking any confidentiality, even though we don't have a patient, client or patient therapist relationship, I've mentioned to my students that, I'm in contact with a number of people who I don't even know. We don't have a professional relationship. It's just they've reached out to me, including yourself, who are pretty much saying, that what you're talking about, it should be talked about more. It's not being talked about in a hateful or insulting manner. It's just saying this is a phenomenon. It describes, a certain proportion of people or percentage of people. And let's not deny it. Let's not deride people who experience it, and let's better understand it. Because it will help people understand what they're going through. It's all about education. So I want to be clear here, because I know some people who either watch the podcast or have followed me, they think that, when I speak out about protecting, young people from bad practices, they think that makes me anti-trans in some way. So they get sometimes discouraged when I say I'm not anti-trans at all. I'm anti-bad science. I'm anti-bad practice. I'm anti-ideology, right? But if somebody, whether it's whether it's an orientation, which we'll talk about that's the reason you're calling it autoheterosexuality, whether we're talking about gender, confusion, gender identity, gender roles, etc. The point is that there's no discrimination, there's no denigration on my part. It's just trying to help people better understand themselves, and by having people talk about it in a compassionate, comprehensive, and I think balanced and accurate way, I really hope other people will resonate and go, oh, that makes sense. Either it helps explain their own experience, or if it's not their experience, they say, when other people are talking about certain things, this is what they're talking about. I'm trying to take away the stigma, the shame, the mystery. So having you on, Phil, I think it's a boon. I think it will really help us. And the fact that you're calling it autoheterosexuality. So there's so I'm going to ask you, you can say Phil, because, and these are not Phil's terms. These are used in the scientific community, but auto and allo, heterosexuality. So you want to just kind of break down the language that you're using so people understand it.
Yeah, there's this dimension of sexuality, location. Usually with sexuality, people think of gender or sex, and there's also age. But the location dimension of sexuality, which is about whether you're attracted to or attracted to being, that's something that a lot of people don't know about. And so, since that is a dimension that's between self and other, there's terms for prefixes for self and other. Allo is for other, auto is for self. And if you prefix a sexual orientation with one of these, it tells you which direction it's pointing, whether it's towards others or yourself.
So then can you just again then say how that came into autoheterosexuality, as so people understand? Because let's assume that people are hearing this and they've never heard of any of these before.
Yeah. So like when people talk about sexuality, the allo part is assumed to be the case and left unstated most of the time. So people would just say homosexual or heterosexual, and they're talking about sexual attraction to other people. But if you by introducing the allo prefix, it makes visible the fact that these orientations are pointed outwards, and it also implies its opposite, auto, which is attraction to being. And this is important because it seems that as far as I can tell, for any target-based sexual orientation in terms of, desiring a particular sort of like love object, so to speak, with particular aspects to it, the direction inversion can happen with pretty much any type of orientation. And so it's really useful to have this distinction because it's a whole new dimension of sexuality that people are new to, and it has new considerations. It's not exactly the same thing as when society was trying to figure out how to integrate homosexuality. This is a new type of consideration, and so it'll take, slightly new thinking to figure out the right way of incorporating it.
So that's a good point that you make, that there's a distinction between, this current distinction of verbiage versus previous phenomenon. So can you help us to understand that a little bit more? So what is the difference?
Um, do you mean the difference in terms of old terms like transvestism or transsexualism, or?
Well, more so you were saying, in the past, society had to kind of figure out homosexuality. So you're saying that this is different, though. It's not the same type of understanding that society has to develop.
Right, yeah. With the thing is with the same-sex attraction, all that society had to do to accept it was pretty much just not discriminate against the people that have it. Um, but when there's this attraction to being, this cross-gender attraction, it makes some people decide to transition because of it, or experience gender dysphoria for being called certain pronouns because of it. And so there's this issue of people would like to be seen and treated a certain way that is maybe not what you'd expect based on their physical appearance. And to accommodate this requires other people changing how they interact with the person. And so this, in a way, this is the trans movement is making a bigger ask than the same-sex attraction movement did, and it's a slightly different ask, especially because there's, the prospect of transsexualism and all that. But yeah, it's just a new consideration because, as far as I could tell, there's with the mainstream gender-based portion of the LGBTQ coalition, there's same-sex attraction, which are the first three letters, and then there's also cross-gender attraction, which is what my book is about, and that's when you're attracted to being the other gender. And that one that one's part of the T, that's most of the T, to be honest, and it's a lot of the Q as well. And also same-sex attraction is also falls under T and Q. And so it seems that the alphabet coalition, at least the mainstream gender-based portion of it, can be inclusion in that coalition is based on one of these two sexual predispositions, and it's simpler than it seems like at first glance.
So similarly, in your book, you mentioned that there's a huge cultural component to all of this. So you cited a statistic. So I want to just pull up my notes here so I make sure that I get the numbers correct. Let me see here. So you noted that in the United States, about 3 out of 4 trans people are autoheterosexual. So, with respect to culture, you indicated that this inhibits many individuals' ability to be their true autoheterosexual self. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, about like how based on how a society is set up, there would be different proportions of the different.
Yeah. So, like, what are some of the cultural factors that maybe you can identify?
Um, and Lawrence has a couple good studies on this about societal individualism and the relative proportion of homosexual and non-homosexual transsexualism. And she found that in Eastern collectivist countries, almost all the male to female transsexuals were of the homosexual type. And in Western individualist countries, almost all of them most of them were the non-homosexual type. And she found a strong correlation there. And it, if I remember in her analysis, that accounted for like 75% of the variance, if I'm remembering correctly. And there's a study, Nutbrock 2011, where they replicated Blanchard's findings about vastly different rates of past cross-dressing arousal among male to female transsexuals based on whether they're homosexual or non-homosexual. And in that study, they collected race statistics, and so I also found that looking at those, 90%, like the black trans women and the Hispanic trans women in that study, 90% of them were classified as homosexual, whereas the white ones were 80% of them were classified as non-homosexual and thus presumably autogynephilic. And so it seems like not only are there this big influence of culture between, the East and the West, there's also within the West, there's a big difference between black and Hispanic and white in terms of the different rates.
And perhaps you came across this, maybe not, but as you're saying that, I'm wondering if um, similar to those sexual expectations, norms, and so on across cultures. I wonder if that aligns with the same percentage or degree of acceptance with the trans communities. So, for example, I mean, with Eastern cultures who are typically more closed off sexually versus Western.
Yeah, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, it was more of just a
About
thought.
that. Yeah. Something I
Oh,
wanted to bring up is you brought up the statistic I said in the book of that like 3 out of 4 trans
Yeah,
Americans are autoheterosexual. And I just want to mention how I came to that calculation so people can decide whether to
sure.
take it seriously. Um, I basically I used the homosexual and non-homosexual sorting um, and took the sexual orientations that were reported in the 2011 National Transgender Discrimination Survey and the 2015 US Transgender Survey. And so these are very similar surveys held by the same organization asking the same types of questions, but the data was collected around 8 years apart. And I mushed those two together. I'm sure there's some people that are in both of them, but I did that because it's a lot of researchers use that data. So presumably researchers think it's acceptable to use that data. And I see them use it all the time. So I used it too. And I did that sorting based on, what their reported attractions. And I found that 8 out of 10 trans women in those surveys reported non homosexual orientations, and 7 out of 10 trans men reported non homosexual orientations. So, and this with respect to birth sex, of course. And so that's how I came out at that figure. And this calculation also is not accounting for any rapid onset that may or may not exist, um, or any other etiologies. It's just assuming that there's only two. And there's likely the case that there's at least a few percent of trans people that are neither of the two, but it's such a small, unless the rapid onset thing turns out to be very huge in reality, it seems like almost all trans people fall under one of these two categories, and so I just assumed there was only two.
okay. And just for language, because you just mentioned a minute ago, Phil, and I want to say that. So whenever Phil talks about homosexual or non-homosexual, he's referring to the birth sex. Okay. And that's why we talked in a previous episode about that's why they use androphilic and gynophilic. It's your target of your sexual attraction, independent of what your own gender or sex or biology is. So yeah, so so everyone's clear, the homosexual again, when Phil talks about any type of homosexual or non-homosexual attraction, it's based on your biological sex, what you were born as. Okay.
Right. Yeah, and the same for autoheterosexual too. Like any of those labels that are anchored to your identity or your birth sex. Um, I always interpret them as with respect to birth sex because if you interpret them with respect to gender identity, they become incoherent.
Right, especially when there's an ever increasing number of genders. So how do you like what do you say?
Right.
Oh, right. So okay, and as I said earlier, I really do think this could lead to a paradigm shift because, as I talked about in a previous episode, I understand, and I think this is why you took the philia out of it. Maybe I don't want to, and I think you may have talked about in the book this idea of not allowing any of these concepts to be reduced to a simple, let's say, like a paraphilia or a fetish or a kink, which might have some stigma associated. You're focusing more as a sexual orientation, and I know there's a lot of pushback. So I'm going to ask you, Phil, about that because I say in my lectures, and I think I said in the podcast, I say I say autogynephilia to me is as close, from what I know, to a sexual orientation as one can get, if not an actual sexual orientation. Right? I can't declare it. I don't have the power to declare it as such. But I say everything I know about it, the development, how people feel about it, and its role in one's sense of self. I say it really does seem truly like a sexual orientation. Okay, so tell a skeptical audience why they should consider this as a sexual orientation, autoheterosexuality.
Well, because it's like you said, like it's something that really affects how someone sees themselves and lives their life. And the reason I talk about this in terms of sexual orientation instead of fetish or paraphilia is that it treats it as a serious thing that's basically worthy of consideration. Whereas if you talk about something in terms of a fetish or kink, it downplays its importance and it makes it seem like it's not absolutely central to someone's emotional well being. Whereas people understand that fulfilling the dictates of their sexual orientation has a huge impact on their mental well-being. And I think it can help sort of humanize the experience and also make sense of gender dysphoria in that it's can be thought of as kind of like an unrequited love, or a sort of heartbreak. And that just it makes clear that it tugs on your heartstrings and it's not simply about eroticism.
Right. And you've mentioned Anne Lawrence at least once today. I've mentioned her as well. She wrote, I think, the greatest paper at the time on the topic, Becoming What We Love, which is
It was
describing
amazing.
autogynephilia. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I can't
this is
recommend that essay enough.
Yes, I think we have it linked. I'm pretty sure we have it linked in one of our episodes, right? Becoming What We Love.
Yeah.
And then she did in 2017 a later version, including that, and she talked about the typology, the homosexual, transsexual, and the autogynephilic transsexual. Again, great resource. But again, the book as well it alludes to or cites it, describes it, really gets into it. So one of the controversies, and I'm going to ask you, Phil, because you were talking about in the book, you have sections on autoandrophilia. So that would be the female to male type of trans person. And I know that I think Bailey wrote either a foreword or a recommendation for the book. I think it was
He
Bailey
wrote
or
a blurb, yeah.
Blurb. Thank you. It was Bailey, right? So because Bailey and Blanchard, unless they've changed their position, say that this is, in theory it can happen, but it's rare, if anything. And you're saying it's actually quite common among women. So what have you received any feedback from them? Have they changed their opinions on autoandrophilia?
I haven't seen any sign that they've shifted their opinions. I know Bailey ran a I think he ran a study looking for autogynephilia in women and it'll come out
Sure.
sometime later this year, but I don't know what he found. And yeah, they haven't I don't think they've come around to that the generalized two-type model that I'm proposing here, but there's definitely cases in the sexology literature that describe females who have gotten aroused by cross-dressing or who fantasize about being a gay man or yeah, like the same sort of phenomena that you can see with autogynephilia. There's papers on it for autoandrophilia as well. And granted, there's way fewer. It's been female sexuality in general has been studied far less.
Right.
So, and that this is, a consequence of that. And another consideration I think I want to bring up as to like when I've wondered why Bailey and Blanchard don't seem to think that autoandrophilia is a major player in female to male transgenderism. I do consider also that um Blanchard was a clinician and he's going based on the people that came into his clinic when he used to work at the Clark. And back then, he worked there from 80 to 95. And back then, clinicians thought there was only one type of female to male transsexualism. And most of the people coming to the clinic also were reporting, like the trans men there were reporting that they're only attracted to women. And so it's hard to say how much of those client reports were based on them reading the literature ahead of time, because that was a thing that sexologists started to notice in the 70s and 80s that patients were coming in with suspiciously similar stories that fit the textbook example of
Right.
what transsexualism was. Um, but yeah, after Lou Sullivan reached out to sexologists and got his story told more, it became apparent that there was a type of female to male transsexual that was attracted to men and could identify as a gay man. And I think Bailey and Blanchard also have some I know maybe more Bailey, he has some strong priors around like what a paraphilia is and what that entails and whether or not that'll occur in females. And I think that plays a big role in his thinking process. My approach towards it was just I in researching this, I came across, in the online spaces online where the AGPs who are into the sexology stuff gather, there was also some autoandrophilic females that were there. And what they said seemed credible. And when I looked in their literature and found that there was cases of that sort of cross-gender arousal described in the literature, and also in any study that has asked males and females about whether they've been aroused by cross-dressing or about fantasizing about being the other sex, um, never is if there's a big enough sample, at least like 100 or so of each of the sex, like never at no point is it ever 0% of either of the sexes. There's always someone that says, "Yeah, that's hot." And so it seems to exist in both sexes, but maybe about half as often in females if I were to just guess based on my intuition after looking at all the numbers.
Okay. And as a follow up, because you said it now and it was in the book as well, I think you said 70% of the sample that you looked at when you look at the studies. I think can't remember if that included the Czech sample, but you said that 70% you would infer for among biological women are autoheterosexual, so they would be into men.
I think the 70% thing is among transsexuals, what percent of them would be of this
Sorry,
ideology?
that's what I meant. Well, yes, sorry, but among transsexual, I'm saying, but among transsexual, so trans men, the women who transition to men,
Right.
you were saying that the majority, if I'm reading it right, the majority would have a sexual interest in men, as opposed to being like
Yeah.
bush
Or both,
or both.
or
Okay,
both. Yeah, right. Or asexual.
right.
The non-homosexual just adds up asexual, bisexual, and heterosexual altogether.
Okay. So just because the reason I'm saying that is if most people think, and I'm just going through, I think people's anecdotal experiences, whether it's real life or on TV or whatever, I believe that most people, if they're thinking of a woman who transitions to a man, that in that male form, that they would be with a woman. So that would be the homosexual transsexual. Okay.
Hmm.
And I would say that, well, I think the sexology research is pretty clear that, and people might be surprised by this. I say this all the time according to plethysmograph studies. So basically, when you look at not self-report, but your physiological reaction to stimuli, it shows that women, all women essentially seem to be bisexual, sexually, physiologically speaking. They have that ability. It's much easier for them to get sexually aroused to either male or female, okay, or male, female, 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 male, male sex. That's the turn on. So perhaps that makes it easier for them to be the non-homosexual type because by definition, all women potentially have that orientation.
Uh, yeah, something about that I want to mention is that there's also, the preparatory hypothesis that, that sort of that response to a greater array of stimuli, or rather like a non-discriminatory response stimuli, that like response is just the standard. That there's also that explanation for why females seem to respond to all that stimuli, just because evolutionarily it would have protected them in the case of coerced sex. It would have reduced injuries and risk of infection and such if they were lubricated properly ahead of time.
Right. So again, that's why I say physiologically, and I say that to my students,
Right.
psychologically, emotionally, a woman might feel only sexually attracted to men, but physiologically, that's all I'm saying about physiologically. So when your
Right.
body reacts in a way, it might make it easier for people to adapt to whatever's going on inside or around them. So just want to put it out there to people to understand that. Again, we're talking about the physiology of the sexual
Yeah.
reaction, sexual attraction. And I know Bailey and Blanchard and others, especially Bailey, though, has done studies, has written about them, and he basically says the science is settled. Right? Females are physiologically speaking bisexual. Just putting it out there for everyone. Okay? Physiologically, that's all I'm saying.
Right. In
Okay?
terms of when they're hooked up in a lab, like this way of
Oh,
measuring it, they seem to be that
right.
way. And they also show a lower concordance between their self report and their genital arousal.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, historically, even 50%, half, and if old studies by Julia Hyman show that half of the women who were physiologically aroused didn't report it. And people thought, oh, that's because they're too shy, social desirability. And she wrote in her paper, she said, well, think of what these people volunteered to sign up for. They volunteered to sign up to stick something up their vagina, to watch a porn film, knowing that they're being being observed, so to speak, that their reaction is being observed. She says, I
Hmm.
don't think they're the shy type. They're not the ones who are going to suddenly deny being aroused. So, and the reason I'm
Right.
bringing this up, right, is this is the complexity of sexuality, whether it's our own inhibitions, whether it's our own confusion, our lack of understanding, whether it's not wanting to be seen as aberrant, as abnormal, as sinful, or whatever. Right? All these factors. If anyone denies that they can have an influence on a person's understanding of or expression of their sexuality, their personal identity, their gender identity, whatever you want to call it, these are all factors that have some influence on how these things play out. So I think it's important to just for the audience to recognize that this is not a settled science by any means. Anyone who says it is, even sexual orientation is not a settled science. We have hypotheses, we have a lot of studies to support these hypotheses, but nothing is proven, nothing is carved in stone. We're still trying to understand how these phenomena play out. So, again, your book is one extra layer to the literature to helping people understand. It's not that simple. Sometimes it may be simple, okay, but there's a lot of complexities to it, and we only benefit by speaking about this. And if someone disagrees, if someone provides alternative explanations or contradictory data, great, all the power to you. But we can't have progress unless we're able to talk about these things. And so, sorry, Malini, I'm just going to shoehorn this question in because of that. So, Phil, the book's only been out for a little while, but have you been receiving any blowback yet from the people who are saying, "How dare you"?
No, I think they're still in the phase of like, I don't want to talk about this. Make it go away. Just have it go away. I don't think they're in the phase where they're like, oh shit, we have to push back against this. I think they're waiting to see if it gets picked up enough to where they have to address it.
So by they, do you mean the scientific community, the general population?
I mean like the more of like the transgender activists that would be doing
Okay.
pushback. That yeah, they and granted my advertising probably wasn't the best because when I was writing the book, I was just writing the book. I mostly stayed off Twitter because I just wanted to be completely I didn't want all the frivolous distractions of social media. And so that's not as great as when I'm trying to launch and then I don't have a huge following yet, but I was mostly cared about making the book good. And now I've just figured out after I make a good book was my plan. But yeah, I haven't
Um,
gotten pushback yet. Not intensely, at least.
And what about reception, not by people who already understand and agree with, autogynephilia, but let's say from people either who are on the fence who may be opposed from the scientific community? I know you're on SexNet, which is a listserv with the aforementioned names as part of it. What is their reaction to, again, this? I'm calling it a paradigm shift.
There's not too much of a reaction so far. I've gotten some like back channel messages saying that, the book is good or like it's important that you're doing this. But I kind of suspect that a lot of the sexologists they're not sure either way, and so they're just kind of waiting for one of the leaders to like make a opinion either way, and then they'll sort of follow them. That's my guess. I mean, people seem to do that. So yeah, I think only once autoheterosexuality and female autoandrophilia get talked about more seriously, will it start picking up in terms of the sexologists talking about it. I've posted a couple messages on there before just showing that any of the studies that ask about cross-gender arousal, they find that some amount of females report it too. That basically autoandrophilia seemingly does exist, even though that's not currently the consensus among sexologists. That if you look at the things that sexologists have measured, the signs indicate that it seems to exist.
Mhm. Right. And the funny thing is, you're going to get some blowback from one unexpected group, I think, potentially, which is, and I said this from the beginning, when rapid onset gender dysphoria started happening, or sorry, when there was a name put to it, when Lisa Littman did her
Hmm.
original study, and now Bailey and Diaz did a follow-up study, which is being retracted. This is all about politics. Okay. I hope
Hmm.
people will look into that. It's,
Yeah, that
it's
one's definitely political.
100% political. It's a
Yeah,
sham. It
completely.
credits the field. Okay. But as soon as, one of the things I thought was, first of all, I have no doubt, and you discuss in the book as well, the role of social contagion, especially affecting young females. They're the most susceptible to that, whether we're talking about eating disorders, body dysmorphia, any of that. Young females are more susceptible to this type of social contagion. But at the
Hmm.
same time, I was saying, I can't remember who I said it to. I spoke to some experts. I might have done it in a podcast where I said, maybe it's also reflecting autoandrophilia. Maybe some of these, because we know that it manifests around puberty when their sexuality comes
Exactly.
out,
The same
right?
signs. It's like, oh, and it comes as a surprise. And it's like, yes, so does autogynephilia. It's showing
Right.
the similar profile.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering. So I think you might get some blowback by some of the proponents of rapid onset gender dysphoria who are saying, hey, leave our children alone. My daughter's simply a tomboy, or she's lesbian, or she's confused, or she has autism, and so on. Which I still believe is going to account for a large proportion of the people who suddenly are trans, quote unquote. But
Hmm.
some of those parents are going to have to accept, I think, with I don't know yet, but yeah, you know what? my child has autoheterosexuality. And that's what I'm hoping, again, by shifting the language from paraphilias. Paraphilia is the nicest language because it's about the love, okay? Love outside the
Yeah.
norm, so to speak, or beyond, beside the norm. But by going even further and saying it's a sexual orientation, just like people had to learn to accept homosexuality, maybe this will help more people, whether the person, him or herself, the family, society, understand that whether male or female, that some people do have this auto heterosexuality, this self-directed, attraction, so to speak. It's not self. Sorry if I say it that way. And I was going to say this to you earlier. Some people call it very narcissistic. What, are you in love with yourself? Okay, that's not what it is. So for someone, when I said
I
earlier,
mean,
let's
ideally, you'd be in love with yourself.
well, not to a narcissistic degree, let's hope, but yes, okay. So, but if I can ask you first, if someone says then, okay, is that what this is, Phil? It's just simply, narcissistic attraction or manifestation of narcissism. What would you say to that? How would you explain the difference?
Tune in next week for the conclusion to the interview with Phil Illy on Awake at the Wheel. Until next time, keep your eyes on the road and your hands upon the wheel.
As much as we love listening to ourselves speak, especially me, we would love to hear from you as well. So our emails are in the description below. If you would please write to us with your questions, feedback, comments, topics that you'd like us to cover. We can do this together, the two of us, but it's much better if we do it together. So we look forward to hearing from you, and we are going to have a segment called Rounds Table, where we're going to discuss the feedback and the questions and so on from our audience, and we will take it to the next level. We're going to help you be able to deal with some of these issues that you might be bringing us, or it's going to be a topic for us to explore together. And we really look forward to building a community of like-minded people who want to do right by others, not just for themselves.